to my YouTube site. This is Fiona Timms, otherwise known as White Zulu. And if you want to see a lot of photographs of my ancestors particularly, and, well, all the photographs in my autobiography, go to www.whitezulubook.com. You'll find tons of information there and many photographs. This particular piece is Chapter 2, Part 2 of my autobiography, my heritage on my father's side. Dad's maternal grandfather, my great-grandfather, William George Brown, always known as WG, and his family owned two thriving industries near Aberdeen in Scotland, in the county of Ross and Cromarty. One of the industries was a woolen mill and the other was an iron foundry. In the 1820s, they discovered that a lucrative trade in wool and iron goods could be had in South Africa, not only with the settlers, both Boer and British, but also the natives. They had realized that what both the newly arrived and the indigenous population needed most was three-legged cooking pots, stoves, and blankets, and the cast iron wood-burning stoves, especially much sought-after necessity for Boer and English colonial families alike. Dover stoves of all shapes and sizes, as well as cast iron buckets, pots, and blankets were shipped out in great quantities. The export business prospered so well that, to save the high cost of frequently shipping small amounts of their goods on slow, usually unreliable, early steam and sailing ships, they built an enormous warehouse in Durban, then Port Natal, a small newly established settlement on the Natal and Zululand coast, which was flourishing so rapidly that it had become the principal town and port of Natal. The Browns quickly filled their giant three-story warehouse to its maximum capacity. The family became a registered company and also began selling other stock necessities such as linen, crockery, cutlery, and other items from gunpowder and dynamite to sweets, clothes, shoes, and saucepans, wax candles and matches, as well as saddles, tents, and all manner of goods which were essential to anyone who was trying to carve a new living out of the African bush. When the very prosperous W.G. Brown business was firmly established, he had Manultree, a beautiful Victorian three-story mansion, also known as 58 Musgrave Road, built on the cool slopes of the Berea in Durban, a leafy hillside overlooking the Indian Ocean and the beautiful blue Durban Bay, and out of range of the swampy, mosquito-ridden mangroves of Durban Harbour. As soon as the house was completed to his satisfaction, and after the defeat of the Boers in the Anglo-Boer War, which established that it was the British who would rule the country, W.G. brought the rest of his family out from the rather bleak east side of the Scottish Highlands to live permanently in South Africa and enjoy the benefits of the boom of a developing nation, as well as a much kinder climate. Later, further down the road, he built Milverton House, another large mansion. Sugar farmers, cattle and sheep ranches, and of course the many South African tribes needed essentials, anything from a saddle to a pin, all of which could be provided by the massive W.G. Brown warehouse. And that far-sighted man was only too happy to supply all the small trading stores which mushroomed up all over the country wherever there was a settlement of farmers. As a result, W.G.'s youngest, and clearly his favourite daughter, Grace Mary, always known as Molly, my father's mother, was a privileged young lady from an extremely wealthy and doting family. When she came of courting age, there was no shortage of hopeful suitors. Ross side of my father's family. On Dad's father's side, his great-grandfather, George Ross of Knockbrek House in Tain, Scotland, is an enigma. It's clear, since the original big house is still there, that he was also born into a wealthy family, as Dad was always very vocal when it came to our highly successful Brown family industry. It was odd that he always clammed up whenever we asked him about the Ross background and how Grandpa Ross had come to be born in South Africa to a cattle farming settler. We got nothing from Dad. It was always interesting to us that he appeared to treat Grandpa, his own father, with some degree of contempt. Dad never ever went to visit him, even when Mum took us four little girls over to spend almost every Sunday afternoon with him at his small holding at Fort Nottingham in the Dargle district. Circumstances became a lot clearer when I read a book written by Pat Mackenzie, a cousin of Dad's, who's done extensive research into the settlers of Zululand and the Natal Midlands. He reveals that the Rosses did indeed come out to South Africa as Scottish 1840 settlers, and, along with so many of their other fellow settlers, had fallen on hard times. George Ross had 9 surviving offspring. There were 13 born altogether to his long-suffering wife, Christine. But 4 children in various stages of infancy died in those extremely hard times, a common occurrence among the settlers. Most of George and Christine's surviving children were daughters. There were 2 sons, the older of whom was James Ross, and the younger, my great-grandfather George. In the 1840s, disillusioned and fed up with all the Bushmen raids on their livestock, a lot of the Boers who had tried but failed at ranching in Zululand and the Midlands sold their farms to new, raw and unsuspecting Scottish and English settlers, who had then to endure the same and worsening deprivations. The Boers moved on in their covered wagons up over the formidably difficult Drakensberg mountain range to the vast, flat and arable plateaus of the Orange Free State, where there were no mountains of thick there were no mountains or thick mist for the Bushmen to hide in. Times were so hard that a farm of several thousand acres could be sold for next to nothing, and in one instance traded for a bottle of whiskey. Bushman raiders in the foothills of the Drakensberg Mountains, where the new settlers' ranches were situated. You know who the Bushmen were. They were the tiny pygmy-like inhabitants of the lower Drakensberg and upper Natal Midlands. I'll tell you more what happened to them later. The Bushman raiders began to team up with tribesmen from the Umkamasi Valley. They formed even bigger, stronger raiding parties, taking up to 100 head of cattle or more, plus horses to use in further raids of a single farmer in one night. I have copies from the magistrate court cases in the Lions River district dating back to the 1830s, describing each raid and how many sheep, cattle and horses were stolen from every farmer in just one night. So great uncle James Ross was one of these unsuspecting settlers and had built a beautiful stone farmhouse on a large property originally called Vlakplaats, which he'd bought from a Boer farmer. James renamed his home Greystones, but it had changed hands a couple of times, each time the land being divided into smaller and smaller parcels, until they became effectively non-viable for grazing enough stock to keep a family alive, let alone make a profit. There were no alternatives, such as growing crops either, as nightly damage by baboons, bush pigs, porcupines, monkeys, and antelope made it impossible to get any kind of crop past the seedling stage, let alone being able to harvest them. My great-grandfather George Ross was born in Pietermaritzburg and married a Miss Anne Chadwick. They farmed at Onverwacht between Fort Nottingham and the village of Nottingham Road, another ex-Boer piece of land, which also changed hands frequently, until it eventually became the experimental station for the rainbow chicken factory farming, a new and pioneering venture in the 1970s. In 1883, George and Anne produced Alan, Dad's father, our grandfather. There are no exact records of how many surviving siblings Grandpa had, but Dad said that Grandpa had 11 of them. There wasn't enough land for anyone other than Alan, being the oldest son, to be able to farm the land successfully. So his brothers had to make their own way in the world with no family fortune to fall back on. This was when Dad always stopped talking more about any more about Ross ancestry. I discovered later that the younger Ross brothers teamed up and became transport riders. If any one of you has ever read Jock of the Bushveld, an amazing book about transport riders, you can picture the images of how they were. These were an early form of haulage contractors. The brothers moved to Pietermaritzburg, the capital city of Natal, the city nearest to Onverwacht, and there they settled to build ox wagons using local hardwood cut from the surrounding forests. They loaded the wagons with gum tree poles, especially grown in Natal and Zululand as pit props for the gold, diamond and coal mines, because they grew to the right size within 5 years and were straight and strong. There were also goods such as blasting equipment for all the flourishing mines which were burgeoning everywhere on that young subcontinent. Sacks of sugar now being grown on the Zululand coast, and even crates of liquor, in fact anything that came in from overseas into Durban harbour and was destined for Johannesburg, had to be sent up by ox wagon, the original truckers of pioneering times. Ross brothers hauled their goods up through Natal, the Orange Free State, and all the way to the Transvaal, about 400 miles. usually using a span of 16 oxen, plus a few spares in tow. They employed a voorloper, usually a barefoot young Zulu boy, to walk at the head of the team, leading the two front oxen that were yoked together. There would be an Afrikaner driver walking alongside, who wielded a long hippo hide stock whip to keep the 16 oxen pulling evenly and as one. One of the brothers would ride alongside on horseback, frequently going ahead to scout the easiest routes and ascertain where the best crossings could be found over the numerous and often flooded rivers in their way. All their own supplies had to be taken along, as well as plenty of gunpowder and bullets with which to shoot game, which they badly needed to augment their meagre provisions. Went along on the wagons to be let out of their travelling hawks coops. At dusk, a team outspanned, usually near a river crossing where the oxen could drink, and hobbled with rimpi, rawhide straps, grazed the veldt. Sheep were also let loose as well to eat and drink, while the fowls pecked busily around and under the wagon, feasting on the bounty of insect life in the long grass. Ross brothers would take their entire families along with them because, for one reason, it cost too much to put them up in rented lodgings in the towns, and the men could be away for anything up to a year, first delivering the goods to their various customers up on the Gold Reef, and then having to round up enough of a consignment to cover the costs of making a return trip worthwhile. So, the wives of the wagon owners, or in some cases, hired transport riders, and those of the African drivers went along too. Afrikaner drivers went along too, some of them giving birth to their babies en route. They had with them their children of all ages, and some took Zulu or other unattached African tribal women and girls to help with their little ones and give a hand with collecting firewood and cooking, using the very same three-legged pots sold by my other great-grandfather, W.G. Brown. If the transport riders could afford it, their families travelled in separate canvas-covered wagons. Otherwise, they trundled along, perched uncomfortably on top of the freight, and, when the heavens opened, or the frost bit into them during the brief but harsh winters, the temperature could drop to -16 degrees. On some nights on the Highveld, they took shelter, huddled under the tarpaulins which protected the goods. Every evening, as the sun set, the little outspan would be a hive of activity, as the men hacked thorn branches off surrounding trees, usually the umbrella thorn acacia, which grows so profusely all over the veldt, and stacked them in a circle to make a makeshift boma, thorn enclosure, to protect their cattle, a milk cow or two to provide fresh milk, as well as the sheep, and, most importantly of all, their very scarce and valuable horses. The bomas had to be high enough to prevent a lion or leopard from clearing it, grabbing an animal and carrying it off. There were also hungry hyenas and packs of wild dogs to be seen off too. Every man, woman and child had to join in to help with the work. They would build big bonfires all around the outer perimeter of the encampment and enclosure, as it took more than a wall of thorns to deter a pride of hungry lions. The women gathered firewood, slaughtered and prepared a chicken, made uputu in the pots, stevepap, milked the cow, saw to the children, and generally scurried about, getting food ready for everybody. One of the brothers would take a rifle and go out to see if he could shoot antelope for much needed meat, and whatever they didn't consume, they cut into strips, salted, and hung on the wagons to dry to eat later as biltong. They would also scout for predators and, if they could, shot one or two. If not, they fired at them as a deterrent to prevent them from coming any closer. To their meal, prayers were said, and when all the animals were safely enclosed in the boma, the women and youngest children settled to sleep on makeshift beds in the wagons. There had been instances when young boys had been snatched and carried off by hyenas for lack of space in the wagon, and who were thought old enough to sleep with the men under the wagons. Men took turns on guard duty, well armed, as they patrolled the outer perimeters of their tiny and vulnerable encampment. They had to be on the lookout for eyes glowing from the light of their bonfires, which they carefully tended all night, feeding them with wood cut from the same thorn trees. Those men not on duty either slept under the wagons or, if they had that luxury, inside the covered one with their wives and children. Just every summer's night the sky would erupt in a blitzkrieg of a violent thunderstorm, and everybody cowered under the wagons, sheltering from hailstones as big as pigeon eggs, down on them with a ferocity that often killed some of their livestock. Bolts of lightning darted down too, like arrows of fire all around them. Occasionally, wagons were struck, including their contents, and those sheltering beneath, and carnage ensued if they were carrying a load of gunpowder or dynamite. These same storms flooded every river, which even in normal conditions would have been laborious to ford, so that the water overflowed its steep banks and became a massive, muddy, foaming, thundering torrent. The biggest dangers lay unseen and hidden. The Anopheles mosquito, which thrives in marshy conditions, would feast on the travelers as they tried to sleep. Adults and children alike suffered from the often fatal malaria which they carried in their bites. Ticks, another almost invisible hazard, carry tick bite fever, a rickettsia type of disease which leaves the sufferer feverish with blinding headaches which go on for weeks and completely incapacitates them, much as malaria does. If the victims survived, they were left weak and often permanently debilitated. Ticks attached themselves to the stock as well and killed oxen with rinderpest, also known as cattle plague, an infectious viral disease of cattle, which could almost wipe out a team of 16 oxen within days. Tsetse flies, large biting flies, which inhabit lowland felt areas, and prefer moist conditions, such as river valleys, feed on the blood of both animals and humans, causing sleeping sickness, human African trypanosomiasis. Sorry, I'll try again. Trypanosomiasis, otherwise known as African lethargy. in people, and Nagana, a deadly and terminal parasitic disease in the animals. There was also lung sickness, parasites which cause fatal pneumonia, black water fever, and red water fever, caused by the same mosquitoes that carry malaria. Salted cattle and horses, the animals which had survived the various diseases and had built up some sort of resistance to the parasites carried by ticks, flies, and mosquitoes, were a valuable commodity in South Africa in those days. Humans, especially European settlers, weren't so lucky, and more of them were carried off by tropical diseases than by any wars or conflicts which occurred in that developing country. It was a long, hard trek, though, and the roads were no more than rutted tracks. Every river, if it was in flood, as it would be throughout the wet season, which is about 10 months long, had to be crossed by swimming the oxen across. This meant offloading the wagons on one bank and portering the load through strong currents perched on the heads of African porters, none of whom could swim, enlisted from tribesmen from local kraals, and happy to receive a haunch of venison or a pound or two of beads and copper bracelets in exchange for a day's labor. Then the empty wagons had to be floated across one by one using buoys made from cattle hides sewn together and somehow semi-inflated. Sometimes, when the rivers and streams were in full flood and the currents were strong, cattle, porters, wagons, and everything and everybody got swept away, some to drown, others to scramble to safety on a bank much further downstream. In those cases, the cargo, sometimes highly valuable items such as gold bullion and diamonds, was either lost forever or spoilt if it was goods such as sugar, flour, tobacco, or gunpowder. The rivers were infested with crocodiles, hippos, and the parasite bilharzia, unseen and much more dangerous, which attacked one's liver and in those days was usually fatal. In 1879, as a very young man, barely out of his teens, my great-grandpa George Ross fought in the Anglo-Zulu War between the British Empire and the Zulu Kingdom. The ruling Zulu chief Cetshwayo, son of Zulu King Mbande and half-nephew of the infamous and bloodthirsty King Shaka, had refused to comply with certain conditions laid out by Sir Henry Bartle Edward Frere, the British colonial administrator at the time, who then sent Lord Chelmsford to invade Zululand. The war was notable for several particularly bloody battles, including a devastating victory by the Zulu at Sandlwana, as well as for being a landmark in the timeline of imperialism in the region. Great-grandpa didn't get embroiled in the notorious Battle of Sandlwana, but did fight in small and ferocious skirmishes around the northern Natal area, and when he wasn't fighting, he had to return to Onverwacht and continue farming. These skirmishes, however big or small, were to the death, and great-grandpa, along with other ranchers, would wade into a tide of warriors, sometimes up to 1,000 determined Zulus, all screaming and seeing the red mist This was a kind of battle fever which came upon them, fueled by intensive training and a mysterious usangomas, witch doctors, herbal remedy, which gave them the strength to do a running march for 3 days at a time, covering 100 or more miles without stopping once for rest, food, or water. My great-grandfather was firing his rifle frantically with one hand and trying to maneuver his horse, just a shaggy little Basuto pony, the other. If he was dragged off or his horse was stabbed and fell, then he was on foot, fighting bayonet to assegai, or even hand to hand, until the rest of the impi was dead or ran away. Not many Europeans survived this kind of close combat. Debilitated from the countless diseases, scorched raw by the sun, and, unlike the crafty Boers who wore khaki and practiced clever guerrilla tactics, the soldiers in their scarlet woolen uniforms were a soft target. Eventually, the war was a victory for the British and the end of the Zulu nation's independence. I recall, and I couldn't have been much older than 4 at the time, Grandpa Ross, sitting comfortably in a cane armchair on our front veranda on our ranch, New Forest, a cup of tea in his hand, regaling us little girls with stories of his father's battles against Zulu warriors and various skirmishes which took place mainly in northern Natal, Zululand, and this is one I remember. It was midsummer and very hot. Great-grandpa Ross, George Ross, was riding back to where his fellow troops were camped out in the veld, somewhere near Ladysmith. He and his horse were tired and thirsty after several encounters with members of a Zulu impi, and having dispatched them and become separated from the rest of his commando, a squad of up to 8 men, he saw a stream and dismounted to lead his horse down to the sloping bank for a long drink. He knelt down and scooped some water up in his hands, and, as he drank, he thought the water tasted odd. He looked up to see that a few yards further upstream, lying almost covered by the rippling water, was the corpse of a Zulu warrior. Unperturbed, great-grandfather simply led his horse a little way upstream of the dead body to drink the clean water before remounting to continue his ride back to camp. We loved these stories and couldn't get enough of them, begging Grandpa to retell them over and over again until we knew them by heart. That is all for this week. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you so much for listening. Next week, there's more to come. I do want to thank John Moslane very much for being my sound engineer, as I call him. But without him, I could not put these broadcasts out and produce these videos. So thank you, John. And you'll find a link to his own YouTube site with amazing photographs. It'll be inserted on this site here. Thank you for listening. Goodbye. Take care. Stay safe.